My name is Dr. James Cunningham. I'm the Director for the Centre for Innovation and Structural Change, and it's my great pleasure to introduce today's programme, today's event looking at leadership in the public sector. For those of you who don't know, the Centre for Innovation and Structural Change is Ireland's largest innovation institute focusing on innovation and structural change. And for the last 9 years, we've been working on and researching on innovation, on various different aspects of innovation, public policy, at firm level, at individual level. And we've received a number of sort of funding from public funded bodies, not known nationally and internationally. I suppose to really focus our institute is innovation, particularly in terms of the policy. So for the last number of years, we've made some significant contributions to public policy at a national level, particularly around innovation. And we have a strong tradition of disseminating our research activities to stakeholders beyond the ivory tower of academia, to public and also to policy and firm level. Over the last sort of 3 or 4 years, we've had a number of significant contributions in relation to last year looking at industry clustering, and previous years we contributed to the innovation of the smart economy. Today is a very significant day in terms of not alone for the authors of the report in terms of what has been achieved, but also its relevance. So think back 3 years ago when Alma and her team were applying for this funded research from the Irish Council for Humanities and Social Sciences, who would know that the timing would be perfect in terms of the current relevant debate that we're having in Ireland in relation to public sector reform and renewal. But also I think the report today is a reflection of the rigour and relevance that is synonymous with our research. Not only is the report very rigorous in terms of its analysis, its methodology, its approaches, but also very relevant, and this is something that has been a very, very strong tradition in our institute. On behalf of my colleagues in the centre and all that, I'd like to congratulate Alma, Gillian and Geraldine in terms of for a very fantastic report and very, very timely. And also what it shows in terms of the value of public funded research in very, very relevant areas. So the funding from the Irish Research Council for Humanities and Social Sciences was very, very important in terms of enabling this research project. Over the next number of months, we'll be developing more in terms of our public policy agenda under the leadership of Professor Kevin Leydon in terms of looking at more public policy series and all of those sorts of different aspects of that. So I hope you have a very enjoyable, stimulating day. You have a number of different speakers that give a number of different sort of perspectives, and also in terms of hearing in terms of the high level outcomes of the report. So it now gives me great pleasure to invite Dr. James Browne, the President of NUI Galway, to give a welcome address and also to launch the reports. Thanks very much.
Gormaga James, a Corja, a Cunningahm, I was in a specialist, one reduce, or the Seneca Roy Blair, Jim Codal, Talk of Shop, I was Winchek Sholim, Turstal Talk of Turstal, Cunningahm, or Taija, Agenta, Venus and Skull, Southern Minoan, Shasnoska. Could I first of all, on behalf of the University, welcome all of you this morning to this very important event, to the launch of this very important report produced by our colleagues in the School of Business and the Centre for Innovation and Structural Change. I want to welcome particularly our visitors from outside who have come to the University this morning, and particularly our visiting speakers. I want to recognise Dr. Marie Maguire from the OECD, who will provide insights into international best practice in this very important area. Also Philip Kelly, the Assistant Secretary in the Department of Leadership, who will talk about the whole issue of transforming public services, and will do a presentation later on the very important topic of strengthening leadership in the Irish public service. Also Dr. Brian Cowley, Director of the IPA, who will talk about leadership development policy in Ireland. And of course Alan McCarthy and our colleagues who have done a tremendous job in bringing this report to fruition. So, as James said, this conference is about the launch of a report. And this report was developed, as he said, by colleagues in our Centre for Innovation and Structural Change. In this context, I guess the important term is structural change. And it's led by Dr. Alan McCarthy of the J. Cairns School of Business in the University. This report focuses on a very important topic, namely leadership, which in my mind is critical in terms of change management and in terms of change and reform in the public sector. To develop the report, the researchers carried out a tremendous amount of basic research in terms of what's happening in the public sector today. And that research was done through a series of interviews with over 140 senior managers, done through a so-called 360-degree process, where in effect they were interviewed, but also those who reported to them and those who led them in fact were also interviewed around the same process. I understand that in total 1,200 interviews were conducted through the web, essentially leadership surveys, and it's the outcome of that work across government departments and the Office of the Revenue Commissioners, which in fact forms the basis of the analysis in this report. The report, as I've said, focuses specifically on the issue of leadership capacity and leadership capability. And that, as James said, is very timely given the government's commitment now to reform and change in the public sector. And of course the establishment of a new ministry, the Ministry for Public Expenditure and Reform, led by Minister Browne. So, as I say, it's a timely report in the context of the change government and a new emphasis on reform and change in that government. I think it's also important to understand, of course, that leadership in this context must recognise the political reality of the public sector and of the civil service. And in that context, a conference held at this university 2 weeks ago, in fact in this very room, looked at the issue of executive accountability and parliamentary democracy and tried to understand the context of decision making in the public sector, given that the public sector ultimately is the responsibility of ministers. And it did that through a set of, I think, interesting presentations from, at the time, the Ombudsman and also the former Supreme Court Judge, Catherine McGuinness. I'd like to recall just some of the comments made at that conference. I think it provides an interesting backdrop to what's being talked about here today. Perhaps the most important point that emerged in the conference, one which we often forget, is that within the Irish public sector, and public service particularly, individual government ministers are in a formal legal sense responsible for the departments. And they refer to a so-called corporate soul, S-O-L-E. In a sense, they are legal entities which stand alone. And in that sense, the minister is the responsible individual in a legal sense for what happens in a government department. Civil servants are responsible and work for government and for government departments, not for ministers. And that's often not understood well. People often think of civil servants in terms of their allegiance to government ministers, almost a protected allegiance to government ministers. And there are some who would argue that there's a need for some reform in this context. There's a need for some reform in terms of understanding the precise role of senior civil servants and ministers, and how they sit together and how they work together. And as I say, there's always a danger of what might be referred to as political clientism, where it might be assumed that the relationship between the minister and, let's say, the senior civil servant is such that it might ultimately promote, for example, preferment on the basis of recruitment, or indeed on the basis of promotion. So what's needed is a very robust, a very independent, and a very effective public service, which is free from any suspicion of that type of clientelism. I think that's a fundamental part of reform in the public sector, that we as public servants, whether as university presidents or whether as senior civil servants, recognise our separate role from the political structure, and recognise our role is not to protect it, not to act as a shield for it, but to work with it and carry our responsibilities separately in a legal sense. And I think fundamentally, if civil servants are to be effective, they must be free to act with both accountability and with transparency. And that brings us on to the issue which is the fundamental basis of this report. The issue of how civil servants can effectively lead change, manage reform in an environment where government charges them with that responsibility, where they may not have the tools necessary to deliver on it. And that is fundamentally the topic, as I understand it, of this report and of today's conference. To me, it's self-evident that leadership is critical to reform and to change management. And as we would expect, that is ultimately the conclusion of this report. However, in arriving at that conclusion, the report points out a number of difficult issues. It points out, for example, the risk-averse nature of the public sector and civil service. It points out the rigidity of public sector structures and civil service structures. It points to poor internal communications, and that is something which I could certainly recognise in our own institution, in spite of our best efforts. It points out the challenge of trying to manage resources effectively. It talks about the constraints that are imposed in terms of recruitment, in terms of selection, and in terms of promotion. And also it talks about the lack of systems to, if you like, enforce accountability. All of this I think we can recognise. All of this is talked about in the public discourse on a fairly regular basis. In my view, it can all be summarised in one simple phrase, and that is that senior leaders, whether in the civil service or the public sector, are effectively trying to lead, in many cases, without the authority or without access to adequate control mechanisms to effect real change. That to me is the real challenge. Are we allowing people who we are paying to do a job to actually do that job? Do they have the authority to discharge their responsibilities? Do they have the tools and mechanisms to enforce accountability? And that, as I say, is the challenge. And I can certainly see that in this university where I have responsibility for this institution, but I'm not certain I always have available to me the instruments to discharge that, or indeed the authority to do it. And I'll come back to that in a moment with a specific example. In a general sense, the country, as we know, is facing a huge crisis. And it's a crisis which we have brought on ourselves in many ways. I mean, I think we recognise that now. And it's not simply a recession, or even a major recession. The crisis that we face is a structural crisis. We're not talking about, if you like, trying to handle a normal economic situation, trying to get back on track through some growth that might occur in economies in Europe or North America, or indeed might be even export-led. That's not sufficient to solve our problems, although of course it's a very important part of it. There's a dislocation in our economy which has got to be dealt with. And that dislocation will require also a response from the public sector and from the civil service in terms of how we handle it. And what emerges from the crisis when it passes, and pass it certainly will, what emerges will be a very different economy. And I believe a very different structure to support that and underpin it. A different public sector and a very different civil service. And that's the challenge that we face, to allow our leaders, in effect, to make that change and make that transition and deal with what is, as I say, a dislocation which requires a response, a structural response. I believe that what emerges, as I said, will be different to what's here right now, and we need to show our leaders have the possibility of implementing that. What I would also say is that even the best people will be defeated by poor systems. We talk about leadership as being important, and I agree it's important. Fundamentally, it's what drives change. But even the best leaders will not succeed and will be defeated by very poor systems. So we need to change systems. And to me, the danger that we face as we deal with today's difficulties is that we may, in trying to repair the public finances, which we have to do, we may design systems which, although designed to deal with that problem, may disempower further those who are in charge of responsibility for making the change that is necessary. We may inadvertently inhibit change by disempowering leaders through the mechanisms that we use to deal with the crisis. I would say that centralising control and centralising decision making, which clearly has an objective around controlling public finances, is necessary, but it has the downside in terms of disempowering individuals who have to make decisions. And as I say, it could inadvertently inhibit the change that is so needed at operational level. What I would suggest is that if the civil service and the public sector are to change, then leaders must have the authority to lead that change, while of course being fully accountable for their budgets and further for the outputs of the organisation they lead. To me, that's the secret, that we must in effect say to leaders and managers, you have the freedom to allocate resources, you have the freedom to change systems, to change processes, but you must do that in the context of a budget constraint which is imposed on you, and in the context of achieving agreed outputs. And I would like to see a system developing in our public sector, our wider public sector and civil service, where we work in that way. We don't have a situation where a central authority tries to second guess decisions made in the outlying institutions or the outlying organisations. That we recognise that decisions are best made at the local level, where the evidence is available, where the information is available, and ultimately where people can be empowered to make good decisions. It is frankly impossible to make decisions in an office sitting in Dublin how this university should run. There's no basis for doing it. And any interference in how the university runs is fundamentally counterproductive. Not alone is likely to be wrong, but also it's disempowering those who are in charge of responsibility for doing it. What I would say is that there's a principle of subsidiarity which we all understand, which we talk about quite a lot during the master's debate, which we might employ with some profit in our systems, and we might apply it more widely. certainly policy or strategy must be agreed centrally, determined centrally. Certainly budgets have to be agreed centrally. But once that has been done, then it seems to me that there's no role for finance or anybody else for that matter reaching down into organisations and somehow second-guessing decisions which are being made, or having some authority to, in some sense, feel that they have the right to sanction a big decision. To me, their power extends in terms of setting a budget, requiring good governance, requiring outputs, measuring those, holding accounting for those, but not in terms of interfering in the process. And as a specific example of it, I would say the issue of university recruitment is a clear one. We've had for the past couple of years, I talk about the employment control framework, which is built around three principles: balanced budget, which we absolutely accept for each institution. Each institution is required to meet to balance its budget, and that we fully agree. I would even go so far as to say the second principle, where we control numbers in the public sector, is reasonable, and in the universities it's reasonable because ultimately public sector employees come out of pensions, which is a matter for the state now. So I think it's reasonable for finance to impose a second principle in terms of how many people might work in a particular institution. But the third piece, where they then have the right to look at each proposed recruitment or each proposed promotion and somehow okay it, have to agree it, to me is ludicrous. It seems to me that they should stop at the second, stop at the point at which they determine the numbers, having determined the budget. And I would argue that's a way forward. That would empower people in universities who lead schools, who lead colleges, who lead universities, to make good decisions, knowing that they have to meet the constraints that are imposed, correctly imposed, in my view, by finance on budgets, and indeed on numbers given the pensions issue. And I say that's the basis of the recent controversy around the employment control framework. And in many ways, as I read this report, I could see echoes of that type of thinking in the comments made by the civil servants who were interviewed for this report. So as I say, I think the report rightly points out the need to empower leaders. It rightly points out the need to allow leaders to get on and do the job. But having said all that, I think it's also very encouraging when you read the comments in the report from senior civil servants. It's very encouraging to see how positive people are and how positive the comments are. I think it's a very hopeful sign for the future. In spite of concerns about systems, and in my view, legitimate concerns about over-regulation and over-imposition of rules and over-extension of authority into organisations, I think there's a tremendous self-awareness among civil servants about the challenge that they face. I think it's a very strong mission belief in the public sector and civil service generally. I think there's also a well-articulated need for reform leadership, and that's expressed clearly in the comments in this report. And that's very, very encouraging. I think that's something we should recognise and take forward as a commitment to change and a readiness for change, evidence in the comments of individuals and in the report. I say that gives me great confidence for the future development of our service. So can I then formally launch the report and again commend those who have been involved in developing it, Alan and her team, the colleagues in the School of Business and the colleagues in CISC. And I also wish this conference every success. Or dúirtméid an our benefit of new and chance on the rádiv. Gramagi was close support for imagine. Have we achieved how she done now today. Also I'm going to target as an result as an goal as an tourist campaign. Premier